Hello, my friends. It's already the third Sunday of Lent, and we hear proclaimed this week, among other things, at least from the church, we hear the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, and the story of Jesus cleansing the temple, cleaning house. So let's dive right in here. The Decalogue, or Ten Commandments, appears twice in the Hebrew Scriptures, once in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and here we hear it in the book of Exodus. And the difference between those two presentations of the Decalogue has to do mainly with the Sabbath presentation. But in either case, the Decalogue represents Moses as the giver of the law of the new covenant, the epitome of law that Israel absorbed from a few countries or cultures around them, other codes of law that you see paralleled even all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi. And at the same time, a particular take on having one God, only one God, monotheistic religion. And the drama this week comes not from Moses so much as the scene of Jesus in the temple. And we hear that in the story told in the other Gospels too, the Synoptics. But in some ways, John has a very unique way of telling this story and reinterpreting it too in his much later Gospel. In some ways, people were doing business as usual because in order to fulfill some of the precepts of the Jewish law, they had to go to temple. They had to, if depending on their income, they had to sacrifice animals, doves, sheep. Even if you had a lot of money, you could buy an entire ox and sacrifice that. Animal sacrifice was very much a part of good temple worship. That was part of the priest's job, was to slaughter all those animals. And if you can imagine thousands of people bringing animals into the temple, they all had money in order to buy all of these animals that were in turn turned over to the priests who sacrificed them. Well, John presents an even more stern Jesus here, who makes a whip out of cords to present a Jesus who is even more forceful, not necessarily mean, but forceful. John makes this story even more dramatic and symbolic. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. It wasn't a money-making venture, this part of Judaism and their religious practices. So in this gospel scene as presented by John, Jesus replaces one by one all of the Israelite institutions that people had relied on for centuries. Jesus here symbolically replaces the temple. He replaces their feasts that required so much sacrifice. And Jesus, as he professes and preaches often in his lifetime and ministry, he replaces and fulfills the law. So the Decalogue we hear proclaimed, carried through for centuries until the moment of the incarnation and the Christ event, the fulfillment of the law. And John wants us to understand that the Lord's life, death, and resurrection replace and complete how God relates with God's people. This Christ event in history is so wondrous and so timely that we see in the Lord's own self-sacrifice on the cross how that now replaces and fulfills all of that temple sacrifice, all of that animal sacrificing. For example, if we go back to the Synoptics, the Gospel of Mark, it may present this story in a little more historically accurate manner. But The evangelist John adds a powerful meditation that draws us even more deeply into the mystery of Christ and who Christ is. Instead of placing this event, as the synoptics do, within Holy Week, after Jesus enters Jerusalem triumphantly, that's when in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's when Jesus cleans the house in the temple. Here, John adds it in chapter 2 to forecast at the very beginnings of his gospel that the Paschal mystery is what must be understood in telling and reliving the story of Jesus and the events of his life. As you know, John's gospel is incredibly different than the other three in so many ways, and what's important here is to understand his take on this story of the cleansing of the temple shows the completion of the covenant of God in the person of Jesus Christ and in the whole fullness of his Paschal mystery, his life, his ministry, his suffering, his death on the cross, his raising to new life, and his being exalted in glory at the right hand of God. And the church places then John's scenario in Lent to again help us focus on what lies ahead. The great events coming in Holy Week are our life. And Lent is about conversion. As Jesus cleaned house in the temple, so to speak, he forced people in a very dramatic way to see the changes coming. If you listen to and read, well, actually, read it yourself, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Read them to yourself because it's probably been a while. But you see that they are commands. They're not suggestions. They are commands from God. And Jesus is now the new law, the fulfillment of the law. We heard more than once already in Lent, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." There is a command from God to listen to Jesus, who presents the new law of love. "This is my commandment, love one another." As Jesus turned over these tables and turned over lives in this story, Jesus commands us during this beautiful and holy season to turn our lives around, to turn away from what is sinful, and to once again listen clearly to his commandment of love, to bring about justice, hope, healing, and reconciliation in our hearts, and dare I say it, our world. So if there's a message here in this story, I would like to tell you to not be afraid to change. What John presents us here is a Jesus who radically changed Judaism and fulfilled it and replaced many of their practices. Consider what we've been through in the past year and how we've had a chance to, for example, reevaluate what is important in a life. We've had an opportunity, without going to church, to experience God and Christ around a table in our homes. We've had a chance to look at our values and see what is most important and who is most important. We've had the opportunity for at least a year now, as we do always, of course, to see who we are as human beings together with the Lord Jesus. Don't be afraid to change, because as you see, when Jesus cleansed the temple and drove out the money changers and freed the birds, so Jesus does with us when we are willing to allow him to change us. He frees us from what is sinful and wrong So let us make this beautiful psalm response our prayer. Speak to me, Lord, this week. I need you. I want you in my life, Lord Jesus. Lord, you have the words of everlasting life. And once again, my friends, may God give you peace.